Hello and welcome to this series on applying the concepts that you learned about in the Application Architecture Fundamentals series to a real project. If you're watching this series prior to watching the Application Architecture Fundamentals series on LearnVisualStudio.net, then I would just ask you to take a moment, put this series on the back burner for a couple of days, watch that series first. The goal of this series is to demonstrate the ideas that we learned about in the Application Architecture Fundamentals series in their proper context. As a result, it's different from any series that I've ever created before. For starters, what we'll do in this series is focus on the first steps of analysis and design of a real solution. And then we'll build the domain layer of an architectural spike. So I've named this series Applied Architecture Building the Domain Layer. There will be 3 other series at least. I think there's a 4th main series as well that I'm going to add on. But as you can see on screen, they'll be called things like Architecting the Persistence Layer featuring the Entity Framework, Architecting the Presentation Layer featuring ASP.NET VC, and so on. The fact of the matter is that there's really just too much material to cover in a single series. It helps me to break things up just a little bit. Another way in which these Applied Architecture series will be different from everything that I've done in the past is that each will combine many different concepts into a single series. There will be a number of occasions throughout this series when I mention an idea in passing or use a technology without really explaining the fundamentals of that technology or that terminology in any depth. I'll create a number of mini-series later on that will elaborate on those ideas. So for example, in this series I'm going to talk about a third-party tool called Fake It Easy. Instead of stopping, teaching you everything you need to know about Fake It Easy and then resuming this series, I'm just going to relegate that to its own mini-series. Now granted, at the time I'm recording this, I haven't recorded any of those mini-series yet, so I expect this will probably take a while to get through all the material that really is related somehow to the things that we'll be talking about in this series. But by the end, we should have what many people have asked for through the years, a large application that's more substantial than what most books or videos cover, all related to a single problem, a single solution. More than covering the APIs, the tools and the tactics that are required to build this large project, the focus of these related series will be employing a thought process to solve a problem. Now, if you miss that, you miss the point of what I want you to learn in this series. The tools and the technologies change often, but the thought process that we're going to be employing in this series will be applicable years from now. And as I've said in other places, you should invest your time in things that are permanent and borrow things that are likely to change, or rent or lease or whatever terminology that I use. And the thought process there is that things that you can use for a long time, go ahead and invest your time in. But if it's just how to use a technology, a minor technology, you don't need to understand all the ins and outs and memorize it. Just go and look up on a blog or look up on their help. Just get enough information to implement it in your current situation. You don't have to just spend so much time learning every little detail of every technology that comes down the pipe. All right, that's all I'm trying to say. So throughout this series, you're also going to witness the process that real developers go through to architect enterprise-scale applications. What you'll see is a lot of angst and a lot of second guessing of myself. I'm going to try and verbalize my inner dialogue so that you can tell what I'm thinking. There's a lot of uncertainty as I struggle to apply the principles that I understand, things that we learned in the Application Architecture Fundamentals series, to a new problem domain that I'm not yet familiar with, and I'm just now coming to understand a little bit better. And that brings me to talking about the next lesson. In the next lesson, I'm going to lay out a scenario of a fictitious company from the recesses of my imagination called Acme International, and the application that they've hired you and me and our consulting company to create for them. So once we hear about their business and a particular problem that they've asked us to solve, then we're going to begin to perform the analysis on the requirements and then begin to design a solution architecture. We'll then we'll turn our focus rather to the domain layer, and we'll begin to identify candidate classes that will comprise our domain layer. And we'll talk through the process of delegating responsibilities to each of the classes. And when we're finished with all of these series, we'll merely have an architectural spike complete. In other words, I'm not going to create the entire application. Enterprise scale applications require months or years to build, and sometimes they have one or more teams working together to actually accomplish it. Clearly, that's not possible in a video series. However, I can say that we're going to tackle a single function of the application and drive the development all the way through from presentation to persistence. After we design and build the architectural spike, most of the hard work will be done. After that, it'll merely be a matter of writing more code in a similar style to flesh out the rest of the application. So you and I, we're going to do a little role playing. We're going to play the part of architects on the project, and we're going to work together to drive an architectural spike through the entire project from presentation to persistence and back. Throughout this and the rest of the Applied Architecture series, we're going to practice what I preached in the Application Architecture Fundamentals series. A handful of things. Namely, first of all, we're going to defer technology decisions as long as possible, which means that we're going to focus first on the domain problem, the domain layer first. If we can get the domain layer correct, then we can build an adequate user interface in the future, and we can decide on which database technology that we'll use again later. We'll also use unit testing to drive our design decisions. We'll use unit testing as a design exercise. In other words, as we try to figure out what methods and properties each class should have and what responsibilities to delegate to each class, we'll write the code that consumes those classes and methods and properties first, the way that we would want to use them. Then we'll go back and actually implement those classes and methods and properties in our production code to satisfy those unit tests. And this has a secondary benefit as well. We know we have now a collection of unit tests that gives us confidence to make changes later, and we can rely on the unit tests to let us know if the changes that we made broke something, and we can quickly ascertain why that happened. And a third benefit is that we stay organized throughout the entire development process, and we're able to move more quickly as we progress. Remember, unit testing doesn't slow us down. It ultimately speeds us up. When we stay organized and when we're confident in our code base, we can be more agile. We'll go more slowly at first, admittedly, but we'll go faster later on in the project, and we won't have to rely as much on the debugging tools in Visual Studio to isolate the defects in our software. So the other thing that we're going to be practicing what we preach is that we're going to keep the layers decoupled by adding interfaces and relying on dependency injection. Remember that from the previous series. We're going to use fakes, and fakes help us isolate the domain layer during development so that we can focus on the domain layer by itself. This will ensure that our unit tests are testing just the domain layer, not code from the other layers, like the persistence layer code, for example. And there will be a lot of fun things to learn and exercise in this series. This is as close to real development as you're going to get in a video series, at least in my opinion. And so as a result, the code, the project, the solution will be messy at times. We'll finish a video and the code might not compile, or the unit tests may not pass as we finish that video. But once we have something working one way, I might rip it up in the name of making it more decoupled or more flexible. Like I said, in the Application Architecture series, if you recall, I said writing software is more like molding clay rather than chiseling stone. We will mold and we'll refactor our code into shape over time. And I can't emphasize this enough. Well, we're going to utilize .NET technologies eventually, like the Entity Framework and ASP.NET MVC and a few others. The key takeaway is the thought process that I utilize. You should be discovering the thought process of separating concerns, of removing coupling, of applying patterns, starting with unit tests, starting with the domain, and so on. You shouldn't be as concerned about the particulars of the code that I write. I guarantee I'm not going to be happy with the code I write. I never am. There's always something better that I could have done, and I'm always learning better things to do. So while the code I write is irrelevant, and it's going to change over time as I learn more, I believe that the thought process that I employ is timeless. It will always help you identify and build reliable software that focuses its energies on solving the heart of the complexity in the business problem first. It'll help you build reliable software that you can be confident in because it's supported by hundreds and hundreds of tiny tests. And finally, this process that we're going to employ throughout this series will help you build software that's resilient to change because it avoids coupling and consistently separates the major concerns of the application. But I suspect by the end of this series, some of you might be thinking, honestly, Bob, I could have accomplished exactly what you did in this series with fewer lines of code. I could have finished it a lot faster. You don't even have a complete working application as we finish up this series or the other series. All you have is an architectural spike. Believe you me, if I really wanted to, I could hack this application together fast if all I needed to do was knock something out quickly. However, let's just pretend for a moment that this customer, this fictitious customer that we've come up with here in this series of videos, wants an application that can withstand the changes that'll come over the next 15 to 20 years. Tell me, which database will they use 10 years from now? Or how will they consume the application 10 years from now? Will they use it on their Windows computer, on their iPhone? Well, probably not. Neither of us know. Think about 10 years ago, the iPhone didn't exist, and we were still in what? Windows Vista, or no, we were in Windows XP back then. Who could have foreseen all of the changes in the past 10 years? And that's the point. You can't foresee it. So you gotta have a little forethought to say, since I can't foresee the future, maybe I can architect in such a way that embraces change rather than in such a way that will make my code potentially obsolete years from now. I assure you, if you start your application development process by choosing first the ASP.NET Web Forms or ASP.NET MVC project template, and then you proceed to mix all of your concerns together, the data access, the business rules, the presentation, all in a single project, you've just limited the future of your application. You'll be doing the customer a grave disservice. Just like I said in the previous series, admittedly, not all problems require this degree of separation of concerns and the like that we're going to do in this series. Some problems are smaller in nature, they're departmental, they're disposable, and so on. If the organization just wants an application finished tomorrow, and they could care less about the impact of change, and they just need a stopgap measure that's only expected to be useful for a couple of years, well, then okay. That's their decision that the organization entrusted them to make. But that's not your call. That's their call. Furthermore, you might be creating this as a startup company, and so you may decide to create what some people call a production mock-up. I take that to mean that the timeline is measured in weeks, not months, and you decide to throw something against the wall just to see if it sticks rather than spending a lot of time creating something that's absolutely bulletproof. You might decide that there's a certain level of quality that you're willing to accept in exchange for something that you can put in a customer's hands very quickly and fail fast if the solution is not marketable, if your business isn't going to make any money. All right, well, that's your decision. In all things, when it related to architecture, it depends, right? Depending on your needs, you might decide to make things simpler. That's fine, but at least I want you to know how to meet complexity with an approach that's equal for the job. You can always remove layers. You can always forego test-driven development. You can always worry about the domain rules if you have any. Later on, you can mix them in with other concerns if you really want to. But my goal is to help you know where to turn if you need a strategic approach to developing an enterprise-scale system. I think we have a moral obligation as experts and craftsmen to lay out the options to the stakeholders and to the management, or if this is something that we're creating for ourselves or a startup. And we need to be honest and upfront about the ramifications of short-term thinking. It's not right or wrong, it's not good or bad, it's just a fact. As the old programmer expression goes, good, cheap, fast, pick any two. So what I'm going to demonstrate is, in this series of series, is for those scenarios where quality matters. If the stakeholders are strategic thinkers and they want something that can be maintained and nurtured for years to come in order to get the most out of their software development expenditure, then you and I need to deploy a mindset, and we need to use techniques that will deliver the system that they seek, a robust, high-quality work product. And that's what I hopefully am going to be demonstrating in this series and the series to follow. At least that's the plan, so wish me luck. All right, we'll get started in the next video. See you there. Thank you.